Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this month's NGB Coach Educator Conference call. Today's presenter is Jean Cote, who, looking at the people who logged in, I will do a very brief introduction because I'm pretty sure that all of you are familiar with his work. And we're going to talk about transformational coaching today. And a couple of announcements, miscellaneous things here. A while back, I created a Slack group. And I'm actually just kind of playing around with this, posting some articles. If you'd like to use that, let me know, and I can add you and invite you to that group. And also, if you've gotten onto this conference call, either through the U.S. Center for Coach Excellence website or from a friend, and you want to be added to the email list about the announcements, please shoot me an email here, and I will add you to that group. A couple of shameless plugs here. First of all, reminder about the North American Coach Development Summit coming up in June. Full disclosure, I'm the program chair for that, so I have a vested interest in having lots of folks attend. We've got a really good program, which will be made public in just a couple of weeks. We're still finalizing some details on it. Some of you, and I'll go ahead and say this, this announcement was sent out to a very select group of people about the ICCE Coach Developer Academy that will be held right before the summit. That deadline for those of you who received that early invite is January the 28th. For the rest of you wondering what that might be, information will be made to the general public starting the 31st, and people can apply for that as part of that. A couple of upcoming conference calls here. Wayne Goldsmith will be speaking in February. And then Ryan Graff from the First Tee program will be talking about their program and some of the coach education stuff that First Tee does on March 13th. And before I turn over to Jean, Dr. Cote here, I'd like to say if you have questions that you want to ask, there's a little chat bubble up here on the control panel. And if you want to type that in, then certainly do that. And I can relay those on. Also, at times, Dr. Cote is going to ask folks for input, ask questions. If you go into, you can unmute yourself. And right now, I've got everybody muted. And so you can unmute yourself to answer that question. And please go ahead and do that because he's going to start out with a couple of questions here to get us rolling. And as always, if you have suggestions for a future topic or speaker, please let me know. I've got a couple more I'm working on for April and May. But I certainly want to hear from you guys on who you might want to hear from. Or if you want to have a topic that you're really passionate about and want to share with the group, please let me know that too. So here we go. Enough of me jabbering on. Jean Cote is a researcher at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. And here's some of his research interest. And I think probably most everybody tuning in this is familiar with Dr. Cote's work. And he is his work in transformational coaching is referenced throughout the USOC quality coaching framework. So, Dr. Cote, with that, I am going to turn it back over to you. And I am going to mute myself, so you should have control of the screen.
Okay, good. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Sam, for the introduction. So it's a bit hard. It's not an in-person presentation, but I will do my best to try to interact with everyone. And you know, I believe that this should be interactive, and I would welcome any questions throughout the presentation as you see it fit. So I'm happy to present Jean, this morning. Yep.
One quick interruption. I'm not seeing your screen.
You're not?
Correct.
Okay. Start sharing. How's that?
There we go. I see the USOC. There we go. I see your title slide. You're good to go. Thank you.
Got it? Okay.
Yep.
So, yeah, so what I'd like to do this morning is present some of the most recent works we've been doing, and a little bit of some of the future, some of the things that we're planning to do in the next couple of years. So this is very, very new in terms of coaching research, and it's something that has appeared in the literature over the last couple of years. But the whole idea and the whole foundation of the work is based on the idea that coaches, interpersonal skills and knowledge and behaviors are probably one of the most important aspect of coaching. So I think the professional aspect of coaching is very important, and knowing about the sport and the strategy and the tactics. But I think more and more we see in the literature and anecdotally stories of coaches that are successful because of the way they can relate to their athletes. So this is not sport specific. It's very general in terms of content, but I will talk today about this idea of transformational coaching and building quality relationship. And the first thing I'd like to do, and I know it's a bit awkward in a call like this, but I would like everyone to think about, if you are a coach, how do you know if you are effective, or if you are a coach developer or leading a program, what criteria would you use to assess coaching effectiveness? And I want to give you 30 seconds to a minute to think about this. And if you're able, if you have a piece of paper or something, I'd like you to write these things down. Like, what are those criteria, those indicators you would use to evaluate effectiveness? So I'll give you about 30 seconds to think about this, and I'd like you to come up with something. Write it down if you can. And Sam, if there's an opportunity to unmute people, and maybe you can tell me what are those indicators you would use that you think would be reliable and that would determine what effectiveness is.
Okay, again, everybody should be able to unmute themselves when you are ready to chime in with a response. I'm still mulling the question over myself.
Yeah, you don't have to be exhaustive, but if just think of a few things that you would use. But it would take a bit more time to to come up with a list. So anybody who wants to?
Well, I'll chime in on a couple of things here,
yep.
And they're largely subjective, although I guess you could put a number of value on them. One is I would want feedback from the athletes or from my coaches that I'm working with to see, do they feel like, just that global impression of, here's something new you've learned, you've tried, you've implemented it, how did it go, worked really well, this didn't work so well. So, again, nothing quite as, probably as objective as I'd like. Probably also depending upon what we're looking at, certainly.
So the feedback, what kind of feedback would you ask for? Like, what would you focus on? What would you like athletes to tell you?
Well, I was thinking more about in terms of teaching coaches who are maybe going to begin a new way of implementing some of the things you talked about in transformational coaching. If they implement that, how do they think it went? Are they getting feedback from their athletes that they like this new approach? Yep. And I mean, you could always do surveys of the athletes and parents and things like that, but that gets a little cumbersome, and a lot of times people don't like participating in those, or getting the feedback from people is challenging.
Perfect. Okay.
All right, we got a lot of smart people here. Come on, folks, chime in. Tell you what, I want to make it easy on everybody, and I'll unmute everybody in case people are having trouble unmuting themselves.
Sam, this is Kevin.
Okay. So, do you want me to just text you when it's over?
Yeah.
Or do you want me to come up and?
Yeah. Why don't you pop up? You might want to walk after.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Just pop up when you.
That's the danger in unmuting everyone.
I think
okay.
we're just going to figure out what you need to run by.
Hey, Sam, this is Kevin.
Kevin. Yep.
Kevin McLaughlin. I guess anecdotally, one way that I would measure it being effective is you go to a training session and you see you see more effective training sessions, or the recommendations that you've been making actually put into practice by coaches? Did you hear me, Sam? I don't know if you're on.
Yeah, I did. I had Jean muted by mistake. My apologies.
Okay.
If other folks have comments, and Jean, if you want to comment on Kevin's as well, and if folks want to put a chat in, I'll unmute you.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just want one or two more.
Okay, I'm gonna start calling people out here. Heidi, how do you evaluate effectiveness in the coaches?
Well, and I didn't hear the first two, and only heard a little bit of Kevin because I got an interruption. Someone came in my office, so I had to take my earphones out. So I don't know what was said before, but certainly the most obvious would be the athlete outcomes and how those are viewed by the NGB and the coaches themselves.
Great. Okay, I think I'm going to stop here. I got what I wanted to get, but I think what you've just told me, if we keep talking about this, what we realize is that if we want to understand coaching effectiveness, so Sam and is it Kevin, you talked a bit more about coaching behaviors, trying to find out a little bit more about what the coaches do and try to evaluate that. And then ID, you talked about athletes' outcomes. So you talked, these things could be winning, could be satisfaction, could be fun, could be these things that happen from participating in sport. And that's within a certain context. So it would be different probably in youth sport than 15 and 16 years old or 17 years old or 25 years old athletes. But I think the main point that I want to make here is that if you measure only one of these things, if you only measure coaching behaviors or if you only measure athlete outcomes, you're only getting one element of effectiveness. And the point I want to make is that sometimes, very often when we do this, in person, people will very often talk about outcomes. You have an effective coach if you're winning. You have an effective coach if athletes are happy. You have an effective coach if you see some skill acquisition. But when you think about it, very often this could happen. These outcomes could happen without a coach. Kids playing sport learn skill, are having fun, they're winning, they're losing. So outcomes have to be related to behaviors. And I think, Heidi, you mentioned outcomes, Sam and Kevin, you mentioned more of the coaching behaviors, but we need to be able to link certain things that coaches do and how it affects outcomes, how it affects skill acquisition, how it affects satisfaction, how it affects fun. So when we think, and I think this is part of the the United States, the report that was done with the quality coaching framework is the definition of coaching with Wade Gilbert that we came up in 2009. We need to be able to link certain behaviors of the coach at the professional, interpersonal, or intrapersonal to outcomes, and then the outcomes there are competence, confidence, connection, and character. Don't hang up too much on the 4 C's, but what I think that is more important here is to be able to see that link. And very often in sport, when we evaluate coaching effectiveness, we don't look at that link. We only look at outcomes, or we only look at coaching behaviors. So, and this is a coaching effectiveness definition that you probably are aware of and you've seen, but really, when you think about coaches' knowledge and behaviors, we have 3 different types of, on the left side here, 3 different types of behaviors at the professional level, interpersonal and intrapersonal. And all these behaviors are linked to certain outcomes. And you can talk about these outcomes in terms of the 4 C's, in terms of competence, connection, and character. When you look at the coaching literature and the coaching courses that are out there, and we did 3 reviews of literature recently, what we notice is that most of the courses, most of what we teach our coaches to do is at the professional level. So you have a baseball coach or a tennis coach. When they go to coaching clinics, what they learn about is they learn about tennis, and they learn about baseball, and they learn about basketball. They learn about their sport, the strategies of their sport, and that is the foundation of coaching. And I'm not trying to diminish the importance of that. That is very important, but there is very little evidence-based, evidence-informed coach courses or training that focus on the interpersonal and the intrapersonal behaviors of coaches. And when you think about coaching, there's an exercise in some of the workshops we do. When you think about the best coach you ever had, very often people remember their best coach because of their interpersonal behavior and not their professional behaviors. So the interpersonal behaviors are really the ability to communicate, the ability to interact, and the relationship that you're creating with your athletes. So interpersonal and intrapersonal, everybody talk about them in terms of that it is very important, but not many people are able to train coaches regarding what are those effective behaviors. And that's what I would like to focus on today. So just as a summary of what I just talked about here, the professional knowledge behavior provides a critical foundation for fostering athlete development, but it is insufficient for optimal development. So I think we all agree that, if you want to be a basketball coach, you need to learn about basketball, you need to learn about strategy, you need to learn about the mental skills, but that is not the end of it. And we know a lot of coaches that are very good at their sport, at teaching their sport, but they're not necessarily the best coach. So what we realize with all this is that coaching is not just about what coaches do, but it's how they do it. So the motivational so those are just examples here, but the motivational and emotional tone, the content and the structures of behavior, the consistency, the patterns of what coaches do, and who do they talk to? Do they talk to the teams? Or who do they intervene to? Or do they pay attention to only one athlete, to the group? So those, and you see the references at the bottom here. We did a lot of observation in the last 3 years and noticed that the difference between a very effective and a less effective coach would be not in terms of what they do in a practice, but more in terms of how they do it. How do they interact? How do they interact with individual athletes? What do they talk about? And it's those little things that seems to make a difference. So I just want to give you an example here of the what and the how of coaching. And really what this presentation is about, it's about the how. It's not about the content. And like I said, we do it, and we do this relatively well in coaching. We're able to teach the content, but the how seems to be forgotten. And this is an example from volleyball. So if I'm a volleyball coach and I have some instruction to give, and this would be, if you observe a coach, it would be classified, or if I'm observing a coach, I would classify both of these statements as instruction, or both of these observations as instruction. And the first one is, you're in a practice, and you can tell a player, close the gap on the block, or I'll find someone else who will. So that is an instruction. So you need to close the gap on the block, and then I'll find someone else who will. Or you could say, looks like there's a gap in our block, and it's allowing some hits through. What could we do to improve that? Okay, so here we got 2 examples of instruction, but done in a very different way, delivered in a very different way. And this is what I think, we know that instruction is a very important aspect of coaching. Lots of research has shown that. We know that the best coaches gives a lot of instruction in training and practice. But how do you give these instructions is a very important aspect of effective coaching. And here's an example here of two very different ways of how instruction could be delivered in a volleyball practice. So I'd be happy to, it's hard not to get feedback and not to see everyone. I'd be happy to get, I don't know if anybody has questions here or feedback on what's being presented. Are we all good?
I think we are. I'm not seeing any questions coming in at this point.
Perfect. Make sense?
Nope, I'm getting a couple of all goods here from people on chat. So
okay, thank you.
You're doing great.
Okay. Okay, so basically what I've been talking about is this coach-athlete relationship. And if you go in the literature, you will find, or we will find, people that have tried to come up with ways of addressing that and trying to help coaches establish healthy relationship with their athletes. And here's a list on this slide of different framework that exists in the literature. So you could think about emotional intelligence, so coaching that are emotionally intelligent, and there's some work that has been done on coaching. There's work that has been done on autonomy-supported coaching, empowering coaching, mastery-oriented coaching. So those, and then a leadership perspective. So those, again, that is, it is not entirely new. People have acknowledged over the years that coach-athlete relationship is important. But we've used a leadership perspective to try to address this aspect of coach-athlete relationship. And again, I'm not saying that that all the other framework or theories are not good, but sometimes it misses. It really focuses on the outcomes and not necessarily on the determinants of what creates those positive outcomes in athletes. So why do we choose a leadership perspective? Well, there's a few reasons here, and why I would argue that maybe it is a better way to looking at coaching than the other types of framework. When we think about leadership perspective, it focuses on coaches' interpersonal behaviors. So as we saw through the definition of coaching effectiveness, that is a very important aspect of coaching. And it aligns with the aims of positive youth development or positive development when we think about leadership behaviors. And one of the things we want to achieve with coaching and with sport is we want to develop future leaders. And I think that, it's probably a very important aspect of sport that we know that the athletes we are coaching now will become the coaches of the future, will become the leaders of the sport in the future. So I think it's a very important aspect of coaching to develop those followers into leaders. And using a leadership perspective allows us to accomplish this. And finally, there's a lot of literature that exists, not in sport, but outside of sport, that really support the leadership theories or leadership theories that support how it could lead to some positive outcomes in followers. And more specifically, this idea of transformational leadership that has been linked with positive outcomes in a lot of different contexts, including medical education, nursing, education, physical education. So there's a lot of research on transformational leadership and on leadership in general that shows that it could be developed through education and through workshop. And this is where I would like to go next and talk a little bit more about this idea of leadership and full range leadership model. And I'll talk about this to kind of introduce where we're going with teaching this and teaching those interpersonal skills through transformational leadership. But first, I'd like to give you a little bit of a sense here of the full range leadership model. So transformational leadership is a type of leadership that we know has some direct impact, direct results in terms of positive outcome. But there's other types of leadership that one can use. And I'm sure that you're thinking, or if you want to take a few seconds to think about coaches, you would be thinking of some coaches that are not always transformational. So we can think about leadership behaviors as varying on a continuum from effective to ineffective and from not engaged to engaged. So if you have a leadership style that is engaged and is not effective, that would be a toxic type of leadership. So those would be the coaches that show anger and hostility, yell, and are doing all kinds of things that are not necessarily positive for youth development or for their athlete development. So we know, again, we could argue on this, and you could say, well, that sometimes that's effective. Well, most of the literature would say that it is not, and that's the coach are really engaged. They're engaged in the activity, but that's ineffective. Another type of leadership is laissez-faire leadership, and basically that is a coach that is ineffective and not engaged. And the best example of this would be, we observe a lot of practice. You see coaches that check their email during a practice, look at their phone, do something else. They're not involved in the practice at all, and that is a very ineffective style of coaching. There's a caveat here. I think observing a practice is a very important aspect of coaching, but that is not laissez-faire. So observation, where a coach is really involved in the practice, is different, and then interact with players and give feedback after is different from looking at your phone or doing something else. Then there's neutral leadership. So basically that's running a practice or running a game without any emotion, without any leadership style. And interestingly, that's the kind of leadership we see the most with youth sport coaches. So we just finished a couple of studies, and it's kind of 50% of the time coaches are involved in behaviors that you do this, you do that, there's no emotion, there's no tone, it's a very directive way of running a practice, running a game. Then there's transactional leadership that focus on rewards and punishment. And you can see here that that's an engaged way of being a leader, but it's crossing the ineffective and the effective part of our graphic here. So transactional leadership, basically it's a transaction. So you ask athletes to do something, but you want something in return. So reward and punishment. And we know that in the short term, this works. If any of you have kids, you know that reward and punishment works. And if you tell your kids, you make your bed and I'll buy you something, then usually they make their bed. Or, but in the long term, what reward and punishment do is that it decreases motivation. But again, in coaching, it is something that is employed and should be employed, but sporadically, because in the long term, it does have a negative effect on many outcomes. And then you've got this transformational leadership idea. And then I'll talk a bit about it more, and I'll define it. But this is where a coach is very engaged, and through the literature, it has been shown to be very effective also. And we could put other leadership model in that box that is effective. There's a charismatic leadership. There's this idea of leader exchange theory. There's other types of theory. Why did we choose transformational leadership? Because it is the most researched theory, and it is the one that has been shown to have an effect. So the other one are good also, but there's a lot less research that really support is used in coaching and in sport. So what is transformational leadership? So why transformational leadership? Well, it's the process where coaches develop athletes into leaders by focusing on athletes' personal assets. So basically, it's looking at athletes as future leaders, and we want to develop those athletes into become. So again, it is not sport specific. I just want to get my athletes to really get engaged, interested, motivated, empowered by the sport, so that they will give back at some point and they will be really satisfied with their experience. So what transformational leadership is that it involves behaviors from coaches that are designed to empower, inspire, and challenge in order to foster their sport-specific outcomes. So whether it's performance, participation, or personal development. So transformational leadership is easy to remember. So the theory of transformational leadership, it comprises 4 I. So the 4 dimensions of transformational leadership. The first one is idealized influence. Second one is inspirational motivation. Then there's intellectual stimulation and individualized consideration. So if there's anything you would like to remember from this talk, or you should remember from this talk, is those 4 I. And I'm going to go a little bit more in detail with this. But basically, you want to be a role model. You want to inspire your athletes, so that's idealized influence. You want to inspire your athletes through goal settings and through some techniques that help them to stay motivated. You want to stimulate them and engage them cognitively, so that's intellectual stimulation. And you really want to make sure that they are perceived as being part of a team, being part of you, and that's individualized consideration. So if we look at this, when you look at the 4 I, sorry, I'm coming back here on the 4 I, and you look at how it has been linked within sport through questionnaire studies with a lot of outcomes that we think are important in sports. So when we ask athletes to evaluate their coaches on intellectual stimulation, individualized consideration, idealized influence, usually athletes tell them that coaches who show more of those types of behaviors will have higher performance, better group cohesion, will develop personally better, lower level of aggression, and will be more motivated. So you're probably sitting there and say, okay, well, what is it though? You know, because 4 I are kind of abstract in terms of, yeah, okay, I need to do this, but what does it mean in terms of coaching? And this is where some of our work in the last couple of years have been to observe coaches and try to understand through observation and through some literature review and trying to look at the literature on coaching and interviewing coaching about their behaviors and their behaviors that are effective when they're interacting with athletes. We try to understand what does the 4 I looks like in coaching, in effective coaching. And this is a summary, and I gave you the punchline before, but I'm going to go more in the details of it. But what the 4 I looks like is that idealized influence as a coach is basically practice what you preach. It's being a role model. And then I'm going to come back on these a little bit more in detail. Inspirational motivation is believing in your athletes. What are those behaviors that allow athletes to really believe in themselves and that coaches show? Intellectual stimulation is involving athletes in the coaching process, and then individualized consideration is a person-centered approach to coaching. Not an athlete-centered, a person-centered, really focusing on the development of the person as a human being and not necessarily as an athlete, but really connecting with the person with the athlete at a personal level. So the results of our research have given us 11 behaviors that we call transformational coaching. And it's a little bit hard to look at these 11. I'm going to try to dissect them. But this become the topic of a workshop that we're now doing with coaches. But really, the workshop is focusing on those 11 behaviors. And then I'm just going to look at them, and the way I looked at them here is divide them. We divided those 11 behaviors into the 4 I of transformational leadership. So when you think about idealized influence, what is a coach that show idealized influence? Well, it is a coach that is able to model pro-social values and behaviors, and that discuss that with their athletes. And the best example of this is, you probably see coaches that are not showing those values, but that are asking athletes to show those pro-social values. And the best example here, we had ice hockey study we did where we had coaches, film coaches during games. Coaches asked their athletes to, during the game, to respect the referee, not to yell at the referee, and to make sure that the referees are adults and they make their own call. And then next thing that happened, the coach is behind the bench, yelling at the referee, telling them how bad they are, and then so you're 12, 13 years old sitting on the bench. You have a coach here that is the perfect example of telling you something and acting differently. So if you want to have idealized influence, you need to model those behaviors that you ask your athletes to do. And this could be transferred to a lot of different things. You want athletes to arrive early for practice. Well, as a coach, you arrive early for practice. You want your athletes to work hard. As a coach, all those behaviors that you want your athletes to do, you model them. And you discuss those things with athletes. The second one under idealized influence is showing vulnerability and humility. And that's one that there's a lot of discussion when we do the workshop. But, as a coach, I'm sure that coaches make mistakes like everybody else. And we've seen, through our observation, coaching being able to acknowledge when there's a drill doesn't work, to say, you know what, guys, you guys are okay today. I think the drill that I designed today or that I developed, that I asked you to do is above your head or is something that we, and then we're going to refocus and then I'm going to, or any kind of mistake, but showing some vulnerability and some humility in terms. So what does that do? It creates an environment of trust. It creates an environment and a team where, okay, coaches, they're able to acknowledge, or he's able or she's able to acknowledge when they make mistake, or when she makes a mistake, or when he makes a mistake. So it creates a trusting environment. So the next four are inspirational motivation. And again, I don't have time and I don't want to spend too much time on each one of these, but this is the importance of discussing goals and expectation with individual athletes. So they know what they know what they want to achieve, they know what's expected of them. The ability or the behaviors of expressing confidence in athletes' capabilities really is inspirational and motivational. So really telling athletes what they do well and finding things that they do well in a practice or in a game. The fifth one here is implementing a collective vision. And we've seen with a lot of coaches, with teams or with groups, being able to come up with a mission statement, come up with something that the team will be able to be united for. And finally, the last one of inspirational motivation is providing meaningful and challenging tasks and role. So again, those challenging tasks provide meaning to the athletes, and that inspires them and that motivates them. The next two are intellectual stimulations. Intellectual stimulation is engage athletes cognitively. So the best example here is asking athletes input. The volleyball example I gave you was a good one, is instead of always telling athletes what to do, asking them questions about, okay, well, what do you think this didn't work? What do you think this play didn't work? And that seems to be a very effective way of engaging athletes and stimulating them. And the next one happens a bit in coaching, but sharing decision-making, leadership responsibilities, so asking athletes to do a warm-up or asking athletes to taking part of the coaching process. The next three are individualized consideration. And the main point I want to make with the next three, I won't go through them separately, but it's this idea of treating athletes as a person first. And we've seen in one study we did where we look at a group of effective and less effective coaches, the main difference was a coach in a practice going to each athlete or making sure that within a week he was going to every athlete and asking them about their personal life. We had an example in a workshop of a basketball coach coaching women, university. So women were a bit older, and then he noticed that. So he's a 45-year-old man coaching 18, 19, 20-year-old women. and he noticed that all the players were watching The Bachelor, and then they were discussing The Bachelor, at practice the next morning. So what he decided to do is start to watch The Bachelor, and to relate to the athletes and to be able to engage in the conversation. But that is individualized consideration. That's this idea of being able to relate to athletes at a personal level. And that means a lot to people. And that's, again, that creates that transformation that we want to have. So those behaviors, this is another way to looking at them. You have the 4 I's, you have the 11 behaviors of coaching. Now we have an instrument that allows us to code those behaviors. And when you think about the coaching research, I want to go back to the definition of coaching. Most often we will code, or we will see behaviors. Coaches give more feedback, give more instruction, give the content. But now here we have behaviors that focus on the actual interaction. And the more of these behaviors that you do as a coach, the more effective you're going to be. The next slide is this instrument that we have, and it integrates now the transformational coaching, which are the 11 behaviors that I've talked about, but also some transactional, neutral, laissez-faire, and toxic behaviors. So on the right side, you see those behaviors on the table here. So we can code behaviors that are more toxic, more neutral, or more transactional also. So there is an article that was published on the workshop that we've designed, that we've developed. We are now working with the Coaching Association of Canada. We're very closely work so that they integrate this workshop in their training and the certification for coaches here in Canada. We're working very closely with Canada Soccer, where we're training facilitator to be able to deliver the workshop. We've offered a workshop at with a lot of different groups, and it's been received very, very, very well. People are coaches. We really engage coaches in a discussion about the behaviors that makes a difference in terms of athletes outcomes. So you can look at this paper published in the International Sport Coaching Journal. It basically describes the workshop that we do. In terms of the content of the workshop, and this is where, this is a busy slide and you don't have to read everything, but the point I want to make is that the workshop has been developed from research, from interview with coaches, but also looking at behavior change theory. And the thing that we want to do in coaching is we want to change coaches' behaviors. So go back to the question I asked you about what is an effective coach. We had a big circle that was coaching behaviors and knowledge, and the other big circle was athletes' outcomes. If we want to change athletes' outcomes, and if we want to link what coaches do to some positive outcomes, we need to be able to change coaches' behaviors. So the way the workshop is designed is that every exercise or every kind of communication that we have in a workshop or function is based on a behavior change technique. So we have activities that allow coaches to model those behaviors, to demonstrate those behaviors, or to come up with an action plan and goals that will allow them to integrate more of those transformational behaviors that we want them to adapt. So I'm going to finish here, but the key consideration here when we think about transformational coaching, and I think the key message of this talk is that as a coach, people do something that has an effect on outcomes, and that is how we should be measuring coaching effectiveness. So when we think about behaviors of coaches, coaches should ask themselves, what I'm about to do or what I did, is it likely to help my athletes to feel more competent, more confident, develop stronger connections with others, or build their characters? So here you go, you have the 4 C's, the outcomes. Again, there's a lot of different type of outcomes. We feel that the 4 C is a good way to look at outcomes in sport. But what are those behaviors that allow athletes to display those outcomes more often? So transformational coaching, some key consideration. Leadership is about focusing on the other and not about yourself or themselves as a coach. And I think one very important thing here is if you want to develop a leadership legacy, we're not looking at huge, big behaviors that needs to be changed. The word transformational is kind of a big word, but it's not transformational at the point of you as a coach or the coach being transformed. It's the coach being transformational and transforming athletes. And that for that to happen, they're just small little behaviors that are displayed every day that we know create and transform people. And I don't know if some of you are involved in business or work, or you can see those leadership behaviors sometimes that are very, very little, very small, but that makes a huge difference in terms of my interpretation of the leader. So I want to thank you. If you want to follow up with me through email, Twitter, I'd be happy to answer any question right now about the presentation or about the workshop, or you can follow up with email later on. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. All right, folks, here's your chance to ask some questions. If you want to go ahead and either put it in the chat and I'll relay it, or if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question yourself, that's fine. While folks maybe, okay, Aaron is giving you applause here, by the way. A couple of things.
Yeah, it's hard to know. I hope it makes sense to people.
I hope so too. Okay, here's a question for you. What are your top 3 responses to coaches who are transactional and use punishment as an integral part of their programs? What would you say to them?
Okay, I'm just looking at this. Top 3 responses.
I guess what are 3 things you're going to say to those coaches?
Okay, well, I'll start with one.
Don't do it.
You know, we sometimes we think about coaches yelling and they tell us that they're effective and that works, and then I tell them, so if it's kids, you know, if it's youth sport, do we see this? Would we accept this in a classroom? Would we accept this type of behaviors in a classroom? And people usually think is that no way, you know, I would not think that a teacher would be allowed to yell at the kids when they make mistakes or when they do something. And I think, you know, people start realizing that sometimes we look at sport as we kind of bracket sport as a separate type of environment, but it's not. You know, sport has the potential to develop people because it's such a rich environment where, you know, you win, you lose, there's adults, there's peers, there's everything that life has, yet we allow leaders or coaches to act differently and because, you know, it builds character. Like, you know, people come up with these, and where is that? Where does that come from? You know, there's absolutely no literature that would support that or no research that would support this and these types of behaviors. So I think, you know, the response to me is, why do we have to bracket sport as a separate thing that's different from other environment that kids or context that kids are in? And it shouldn't be. You know, you can be way more effective by being, you know, sometimes you have to be transactional, or you know, in a game or but you don't have to be toxic though, and you know, when it's so I think, again, related to this question, we would not expect transformational leadership coaching to happen all the time in the practice. You know, you would see, and I think we need to find out a little bit more, what is the ratio of being transformational and transactional, and as parents, or as, you know, sometimes you need to be transactional, but you know, showing more transformational behaviors will have a more positive impact. I don't know if that helps.
I think, John, I think you and I have talked about this when we talked before, is coaches often refer to themselves, I'm thinking about high-level coaches that you see on TV. So basketball, football, baseball, hockey coaches who, when they get interviewed, they consider themselves to be teachers, and yet, down at lower levels, we let them get away with stuff that a teacher would, never be able to get away with in the classroom. So if you're going to call yourself a teacher, then I think you should hold yourself to a little higher standard than yelling and screaming at the kid who just dribbled the ball off his foot. All right, what are some strategies to help and to convince very successful long-time coaches to start to migrate towards TFL, and where do we start? And that person stole my question on that one.
What are some strategies to help and convince?
Yeah, I think this is one. I'd made a note about this earlier that when you ask coaches what they want, it's almost always X's and O's, technical and tactical stuff. But my impression is a lot of coaches are getting a lot of that, and to get outside that comfort zone, that seems to be a challenge.
So when I look at ID's question here, I don't need the one thing that kind of when I look at the question, it kind of concerned me a bit when you say very successful long-time coaches to start to migrate towards TFL. If they're very successful long-time coaches, I would think that they're probably showing those types of behaviors. And I think, and they don't know, they just don't know the vocabulary, or they just, or they just don't. If we observe a swimming coach here in our town that has won the honors of Canada, one of the best youth sport coach, swimming coach for athletes with disability, and she never really did a lot of coaching certification, but she is just a fantastic person. And when you observe them, and when we show, we observe them, and there's a lot of our study that came from that coach. And then when we show her the 11 behaviors that we ended up with, she said, oh yeah, well, that's basically her. And she does these things, but she's kind of not even aware that she does these things. It's just part of her. It's part of her coaching. So I think, to me, we want to stay away from, theories, but how do we get coaches to care? How do we get coaches to relate at a personal level with their athletes? And that's the beginning of everything. That would be the start of, and then using the 4I, using the 11 behaviors as a way to describe what is caring, what is being personable, what is but people can adjust these things, and I think it's just what I presented today is giving us a vocabulary. It's giving us something we can start talking about instead of just staying at a very general level. So I don't know if it answers your question, ID, but I would really try to understand what that coach do if that coach was successful for a long time, and really work, on very small little things, adjustments. Everybody's asleep? You still there?
Oh, I'm sorry. I muted myself and didn't realize it.
Oh, okay.
John, you had mentioned the workshops you're doing, and also I've played around on the Queen's University website. Maybe talk a little bit about some other resources that you guys have available that we might be able to tap into.
Yeah, well, if you go to our website, you can download some of those papers that we have. We would certainly be available and open to, share the workshop. At this point, we are testing the workshop to see if it makes differences in terms of pre and post, differences in terms of changing coaches' behaviors, and differences in terms of changing athletes' outcomes. So we're right in the middle of data collection. So if anybody is interested to in the workshop, we would be very willing to at a very low cost, because if we can get data, we're happy. We want to test this thing, and we want to see if it does create the changes that have been shown to be creating in other areas. It's promising at this point, but I think so I think contacting me, and I would probably pass Jennifer Turnage, which is that's her work. She's a postdoctoral student. I guess, Sam, you had interaction with Jennifer.
Yes,
but
actually
Jennifer
interviewed her.
would be willing to travel to go and offer the workshop at different places. And like I said, I think I don't get excited too often about research, but to me, whenever I deliver this workshop, it's always so exciting in terms of how it's received by coaches and the discussion that it creates around those interpersonal behaviors. And so I think it's kind of what we can offer at this point.
Well, one of the things, I'm going to throw this out to the group, and for those of you who are listening to this on recording maybe months from now, may not be so much, but since this transformational coaching is really not about the what you coach, but the how, there may be some opportunities for some of our sports to, find a place to do this where you might have a figure skating coach, golf coach, tennis coach, hockey coach, fencing coach come in and all be in one room together. And I actually find that a very exciting environment when you get coaches from different sports together, and sharing. And I think that may be one of those that we could help, maybe defer costs. So maybe I'll kick that around with our group here and see if we can maybe figure out something to do with that. Got a question here from Ryan that just popped in. It's
a very good question, Ryan.
Yeah. So in terms of it, it's kind of which do you start with?
Yeah.
Do you start with the X's and O's, or do you start with do you start with the what, or do you start with the how?
Yeah, I struggle with that, and I just had a discussion with Canada Soccer. Jason DeVos is the technical director of development for Canada Soccer, and this is the kind of the group that we're doing most of the work. And he thinks that this is the first course that they should have, that coaches should have, before they learn all the more of the professional knowledge around their sport. So I think that's one approach that you can use. I'm not convinced it's the best way. I'm wondering if coaches should have a little bit of experience coaching and a bit of content before they go to that, because I'm wondering if it's going to have the same impact. If you come in as a new coach, you didn't learn too much about your sport, but you're learning about the how. So I'm sorry, Ryan, I cannot really answer your question, but I've been struggling with that quite a bit. And I would be happy to listen to what people think, but I would think that a bit of a foundation would be better before they get this than a brand new coach who hasn't done anything and suddenly we're talking about transformational coaching. So that's but it's really, there's not much that I can back up my answer here on.
Oh, I think many of us struggle with where do we integrate this in. As I mentioned earlier, I think so many coaches, when you ask them what they want, it's the X's and O's, the technical, tactical, and I've in the past always tried to slide this stuff in as oh, well, you came for this, we're going to give you that, but we're also going to add this onto here, and I refer to it as sneaking it into them. And once you have them captive in there, it's harder for them to get up and walk out. So Yeah, Ryan, I think a lot of people are grappling with that. You're in a boat with a lot of us, buddy.
Yeah, and I think we've delivered the workshop to high-level coaches, who have had a lot of experience, and I think the discussion just go into a different direction, and we deliver it also with coaches that are just kind of at the beginning of coaching. So you don't get the same discussions, in terms of with more experienced coaches, you get you get a lot of stories. And I think that's the main thing about this workshop. are stories. For each of the behaviors, we're trying to come up with stories that make sense. And we try to get coaches to share their stories, share what they do or what they did. And very often with more experienced coaches, they say, they realize, oh, I do this all the time. I'll keep doing this. I keep asking questions, but I didn't realize that it was something that has been shown through research that it's an important behaviors. So the more experienced coaches, they kind of realize that what they're doing now is validated. While the younger coaches, now they say, okay, I need to come up with. So we're giving the story more to the younger coaches, while the older or more experienced coaches, sometimes they just come up with their thing. So I think that's kind of a skill from the person who delivered the workshop to be able to judge what, the type of stories that people have and get coaches to talk.
Okay. Well, John, I want to go ahead and I want to wrap this up. We've hit we've kind of hit our an hour mark here, and I've tried to keep them to that. And I want to thank you for sharing the information and giving some updated information on transformational coaching. And, of course, I want to thank everybody who joined us on the call, and those of you who maybe listened to the recording. Thanks a lot for joining us here. And with that, Jean, thanks a lot. I appreciate it and know everybody does as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, everyone, have a great rest of your day. And
okay,
that will conclude our workshop here.
Thank you.